The entire grand hall held its breath. Don Pietro Castone, the most feared patriarch in the Sicilian underworld, had just watched a trembling server spill water across his sleeve. A minor mistake, an unforgivable insult, the kind that, in another era, would have ended in a shallow grave outside Palermo. He thought the girl in the red skirt was nobody. He thought she would step back like all the others. He was catastrophically wrong. Instead of retreating, the tiny waitress stepped forward. She didn't apologize in English. She didn't apologize at all. She set down her tray with the quiet precision of someone who had done far more dangerous things in far more dangerous rooms, and she bowed. Not a nervous dip of the head, a bow, deep, controlled, ancient. And then she spoke 3 words. 3 words in a dialect so old, so buried, so violently erased from the world that the Don's own bodyguards didn't recognize it. But Don Pietro did. His hand, the hand that had signed death warrants for 30 years, stopped midair. The crystal glass slipped from his fingers. It didn't shatter. It landed on the carpet with a thud that echoed through the marble hall like a gunshot no one else could hear. In that single, frozen moment, Don Pietro Castone, a man who feared nothing and no one, went pale. Because he recognized the dialect, and he recognized what it meant. The ghost was real. The ghost was here. And the ghost was wearing a white blouse and a red skirt, balancing a serving tray in the most expensive room in New York City. Stephen Castone, standing 3 feet away with the cold, predatory stillness of a man who had survived 23 assassination attempts, watched his father's face do something he had never seen it do in 38 years. It cracked. The kitchen of the Marble Heights smelled of black truffle foam, seared wagyu, and the specific, suffocating panic that only descends when the most dangerous family in the northeastern United States is 11 minutes away. Move, move, move. Richard, the floor manager, was already unraveling. He blotted his forehead with a pressed linen square, a gesture so practiced it had become a nervous tic. His eyes cutting between the entrance, the clock, and the rows of staff lined up for inspection like soldiers before a battle they hadn't volunteered for. It was 7:49 p.m. They had 11 minutes. Lucy adjusted her apron and kept her eyes on the floor. She was good at that. At 23, she had spent 3 years perfecting the art of disappearing in plain sight. She wore her dark hair pinned into a severe braided knot that pulled at her temples. She moved softly, always softly, never fast enough to be noticed, never slow enough to be called out. She had a talent for existing in a room without anyone being able to recall afterward that she had ever been in it. It was not an accident, it was survival. Cavallo! Richard snapped his fingers in her face. She flinched, she always flinched, even when she was ready for it. Old instincts, hard ones. Water station, sparkling, still, mineral, you pour, you disappear, you do not make eye contact, you do not speak. If I hear your voice tonight, you're finished. Are we clear? Yes, sir. Good, because tonight is not a dinner. Tonight is a... He paused, smoothing his lapel like a man reaching for composure he had already lost. A geopolitical event. The Castone family has taken the entire East Wing. Don Pietro has flown in from Catania for the first time in 7 years. His son Stephen will be present. Lucy felt the name land somewhere behind her sternum. She kept her face blank. I understand. She turned back to the polishing station and picked up a crystal goblet. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. That was another thing she had trained into herself over years of wanting them not to be. Stephen Castone. She knew the name the way you know the shape of a scar you've stopped looking at. The Castones owned the waterfront, 3 construction empires, and the silence of every judge in the Second Circuit. They were what happened when old-world Sicilian power decided to dress itself in a $4,000 suit and learn to speak in board meetings instead of back alleys. But Stephen was something different, something newer and more ruthless than his father, which, according to people who had stopped existing shortly after saying so, was the most terrifying sentence in the English language. You okay? Ricky, the sous chef, appeared at her elbow, eyes flicking toward her with the quiet concern of someone who had noticed too many things and was smart enough to say nothing about any of them. "You've been rubbing that glass for 2 minutes." "I'm fine," Lucy said, "just focused." "It's the Don," Ricky murmured, dropping his voice, turning back to his station. "Word in the back is he came in with a mood. Some deal in the Balkans collapsed. He's been making examples." Lucy said nothing. She put the glass down, picked up another, started polishing. "Just keep your head down," she told herself. The same thing she told herself every night, every shift, every time a dark suit walked through a door and her body went on alert before her mind could catch up. You are nobody. You are Lucy. You are a waitress. You are invisible. The oak doors at the front of the hall swung open. The kitchen went quiet, not the polite quiet of professional focus, the cellular, animal quiet of prey recognizing predators. Richard flew back through the kitchen door, white-faced. "They're here. Line up, now." They didn't enter. They arrived. The 4 men who came first were architecture, broad, immovable, scanning the room with the flat, methodical attention of men who had long since stopped seeing people and started seeing only threat vectors. Their suits were dark. Their earpieces were invisible. Their eyes were not. But the 2 men in the center, the 2 men who walked through the room like it had been built specifically to frame them, they were something else entirely. Don Pietro Castone was 71 years old and looked like he had been carved from Sicilian limestone and left to weather for a century. His overcoat was black. His hair was white. His face held the absolute, immovable stillness of a man who had long ago decided that the world would bend to him and had been proven right so many times that the belief had calcified into certainty. And to his left, 1/2 step behind with the coiled patience of something that had learned to wait before it struck, Stephen. Tall, dark suit, neck and hands mapped in ink that had no business existing on a man at a dinner like this, and yet somehow made him look more dangerous for the contrast, not less. He wasn't scanning the room the way his guards were. He was reading it, absorbing it. His eyes moved slowly, methodically, and then, for 1/2 second that lasted approximately 10 years, they landed on Lucy. She looked down at her tray. Her hands were still steady. "Nobody," she reminded herself. "You are nobody." She had no way of knowing that in 47 minutes, 3 words she hadn't planned to say would end that particular lie forever. Lucy had learned to read a room the way other people read weather. The slight shift in barometric pressure before a storm. The stillness that preceded something violent. She had been reading rooms since she was 9 years old, and she had not been wrong once. Tonight, the room was screaming. She had arrived at the Marble Heights at 4 in the afternoon, 2 hours before her shift, the way she always did when the stakes were high enough to warrant it. She restocked the water stations, memorized the table configurations, mapped 3 separate exit routes from the East Wing, a habit so deeply embedded she no longer noticed she was doing it. She changed into her uniform in the staff bathroom, white blouse, black belt, red skirt that she hated for exactly one reason. It was too easy to remember, too easy to pick out in a crowd. But it was the dress code, and arguing about the dress code would make her memorable in a different way. So she wore it. By 6 o'clock, she had already refilled the bread station twice, redirected a panicking junior server away from the wrong table, and talked Richard down from the particular species of hysteria that only visited him when the booking exceeded $200,000. By 7, she had achieved something close to invisible. She was part of the room's furniture, a quiet fixture. A girl in a red skirt who moved softly and kept her eyes down and could not, under any reasonable circumstances, be considered interesting. She was very good at not being interesting. And then the doors opened, and Stephen Castone walked in, and the entire careful architecture of her ordinary evening began, quietly, to collapse. She felt him before she saw him. That was the thing no one would believe if she ever said it out loud. The way the air in the room reorganized itself around his presence. The way the low hum of conversation dropped by 3 degrees of warmth. The way even the candlelight seemed to recalibrate. She was at the far water station, back half turned, and the hairs on the back of her neck rose with the clean, biological certainty of an alarm. She turned slowly. Don Pietro moved through the entrance with the gravity of a man who had never once in his life needed to announce himself. He was everything the rumors described, and somehow, impossibly, more. Age had not diminished him. It had concentrated him. Distilled 70 years of power and patience and absolute, immovable will into something that occupied a room the way a stone occupies water, displacing everything around it simply by existing. But it was Stephen who held her gaze for 1/2 second too long. He wasn't looking at the room anymore. He was looking at her. Lucy dropped her eyes to her tray, breathed once, and walked in the opposite direction. Nobody, she reminded herself. You are nobody. The night had barely started. It was the younger server who broke everything. Marcus, 19 years old and 3 weeks into the job, had been assigned to the Don's table as a compliment, Richard's logic being that youth projected harmlessness, and harmlessness was the safest possible energy to project at a man like Don Pietro Castone. What Richard had failed to account for was that Marcus was also terrified, and terrified hands do unreliable things. The sparkling water went left when it should have gone right. It caught the edge of the Don's sleeve, not a flood, not a disaster, barely a splash. But in the particular silence of that table, in that wing, in that room, it landed like a declaration of war. Don Pietro did not move. He did not raise his voice. He simply turned his head and looked at Marcus with the patient, absolute stillness of a man who had never once needed to raise his voice to make someone understand they had made a catastrophic mistake. Marcus went the color of uncooked dough. Lucy was 4 steps away. She saw it happen in the slowed-down, crystalline way that emergencies always arrived for her, each frame separate and precise, her mind already 3 moves ahead of the moment. She saw Marcus open his mouth to apologize in English. Stumbling, junior server English. The kind of apology that would land on a man like Don Pietro as a second insult layered over the first. She moved without deciding to. Her tray found the nearest surface. Her feet crossed the marble floor. And before Marcus could produce a single syllable, Lucy stepped gently in front of him, angled her body so that she stood between the boy and the Don's gaze, and she bowed. Not a service bow, not the head dip of a nervous employee. The real thing. Back straight, hands folded, the deep, formal, unhurried bow of a court that had not existed for 40 years and had never existed in this country at all. And in the silence that followed, before her rational mind could arrest the impulse, 3 words came out of her mouth. Old words, hard words, words that tasted like stone and salt and the specific grief of something extinct. The dialect of the mountain guard. The silence that followed was a different species from the silence before it. The before silence had been the quiet of a room being careful. This silence was the quiet of a room that had stopped breathing entirely. She felt at the moment the words left her, the cold flood of recognition, the internal scream of every survival instinct she had spent 3 years cultivating. Her eyes stayed down. Her bow held. Her hands did not shake. But she felt Don Pietro go still in a way that had nothing to do with anger. And she felt Stephen's gaze find her like a blade finding a seam. You just ended your invisible life, something inside her said quietly. She already knew. She made it 40 minutes before he found her. 40 minutes of moving through the hall with the measured calm of someone who had not just detonated a grenade in the middle of the most dangerous dinner in New York City. 40 minutes of refilling glasses, redirecting servers, keeping her eyes at the precise downward angle that said I am furniture, I am background, I am no one worth looking at. 40 minutes of feeling the back of her neck burn with the specific heat of being watched by someone who was very good at watching. She was in the service corridor, halfway through restacking a tray, when the door behind her opened and the temperature in the room dropped 4 degrees. She didn't turn around. She already knew. "Close the door," Stephen said to someone behind him. She heard it click shut, heard the shift in the air that meant they were alone. She kept her hands moving, methodical, deliberate, a woman finishing a task, not a woman managing her own heartbeat with both hands. "Put the tray down." His voice was quiet, That was the thing about genuinely dangerous men she had learned long ago. They never needed volume. Volume was for people who were still trying to establish dominance. Stephen Castone had never needed to establish anything. She set the tray down. She turned around. He was closer than she'd expected, not threatening, not quite, but occupying the space between them with the deliberate precision of someone who understood exactly what proximity communicated. Up close, the tattoos mapped across his neck and hands were more intricate than she'd allowed herself to notice in the hall. She kept her eyes on his face. His face gave her nothing back. "Who are you?" he said, not a question, a procedure. "Lucy Cavallo. I've worked here for—" "That's not what I asked." The silence stretched. She held it, which she could see surprised him. Most people rushed to fill silences that Stephen Castone created. She had learned, a long time ago, that rushing to fill a silence was the same as handing someone a map of your fear. "Where did you learn it?" he said. "The dialect." "I don't know what you mean." Something moved behind his eyes, not anger, something colder and more considered than anger. "My father hasn't heard those words spoken aloud in over 30 years. In 30 years, I have never seen that man's hands stop moving. Not once." He took one step closer. "You stopped his hands. A waitress in a red skirt stopped my father's hands. So I'll ask you one more time, and I'd like you to understand that I am not a man who asks things 3 times. Lucy looked at him steadily. Her pulse was perfectly, professionally calm. Lie, every survival instinct told her. Lie beautifully and completely and walk away from this building tonight and never come back. She opened her mouth, and the kitchen door burst open. It was Reki. A pan had caught fire on the line, nothing catastrophic, the kind of small kitchen emergency that resolved itself in under 90 seconds, but it bought her exactly the interruption she needed. Stephen's attention fractured toward the door for half a beat, and in that half beat Lucy breathed, reset, and rebuilt the wall behind her eyes so completely that by the time he looked back at her, she was simply a tired waitress waiting for a conversation to end. He studied her for 3 seconds longer, then was comfortable. Then he said, quietly, "We're not finished," and walked back through the door with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never once in his life needed to chase anything. Lucy waited until the door clicked shut. Then she gripped the edge of the steel counter behind her and let herself have 4 seconds of honesty. The lockjaw, white-knuckled kind, before she straightened, smoothed her blouse, and went back to work. It was during the dessert course that she saw the tattoos properly. Stephen had removed his jacket, the room ran warm, and the Castone guards had relaxed by degrees as the evening passed without incident. He stood near the east window, one hand in his pocket, talking to a man Lucy didn't recognize, and the ink on his forearm caught the candlelight at an angle that turned it from decoration into something else entirely. She stopped moving. She was across the room, 30 feet at least, but she had grown up memorizing certain shapes the way other children memorized prayers, and the shapes on Stephen Castone's forearm were not art. They were coordinates. Not GPS coordinates, older than that. The notation system her father had used, the private cartographic language he had developed over 20 years to protect the locations of the Valenti family archives. The ledgers, the records, the documented evidence of every transaction, every alliance, every betrayal that the underworld had spent 4 decades trying to erase. The material that, if it surfaced, would restructure the entire eastern seaboard's criminal architecture overnight. The material that men had burned her family home to the ground to find. Lucy's tray was completely still in her hands. She looked at the tattoos, the ones climbing his neck, the ones mapping both forearms, the ones she had dismissed as the aesthetic of a modern boss who wore his brutality decoratively. And she understood, with the cold, rearranging clarity of a woman who had been searching for something for 10 years without knowing it still existed, that she had been looking at the answer all along. Her father hadn't destroyed the archives before he died. He had hidden them, encoded their locations, and somehow, through channels she could not yet construct, across a decade of blood and silence and intermediaries who were all certainly dead, Those coordinates had ended up on the skin of the one man in the world most likely to kill her for knowing what they meant. She looked up from Stephen's arm. He was already looking at her. She was summoned at 10:43. Not by Stephen, by the Don himself. A quiet word passed through the most senior of his bodyguards, delivered to Lucy with the careful neutrality of a man conveying a message he had no interest in understanding. The guard simply appeared at her elbow, said the Don requests water, still, personally served, and walked away. Richard, overhearing, went the color of old chalk. Lucy picked up the correct bottle, the correct glass, and walked to the east wing alone. Don Pietro was seated at the far end of the private dining room, the rest of his table cleared, his captains relocated to the anteroom beyond the partition. The shift was subtle enough that no one would remark on it, deliberate enough that Lucy understood exactly what it meant. He had emptied the room. He had done it without anyone noticing he had done it. She set the glass down, poured, straightened. "Sit," he said in Italian. Every protocol she had ever been trained in, every layer of her carefully constructed civilian life, told her to decline politely. She pulled out the chair and sat. For a long moment, Don Pietro said nothing. He looked at her the way very old men look at things they thought they had lost, not with surprise, because men like him had long since surrendered to the discipline of never showing surprise, but with a quality of stillness that was its own kind of language. "Your hands," he said finally, still in Italian, "are completely steady." "I'm a waitress," Lucy said. "Steady hands are occupational." The faintest movement crossed his mouth. Not quite a smile, the memory of one. "The greeting you used," he said, "is not taught, it cannot be researched, it cannot be approximated." He paused. "It can only be inherited." Lucy said nothing. Don Pietro looked at her for a long moment with eyes that had seen 70 years of people trying to conceal things from him. Then he reached slowly into his breast pocket and produced a small object, a coin, old and worn smooth, the kind of coin that no longer existed in circulation. He set it on the table between them without comment. Lucy's breath stopped in her chest. She knew that coin. She had held its twin in her palm at 9 years old, in a house that no longer existed, given to her by hands she could no longer fully remember. She did not touch it. She did not look up. "My son," Don Pietro said quietly, "is watching this room from the anteroom window. He has been watching for the last 4 minutes." He picked up his water glass with the unhurried elegance of a man having an entirely ordinary conversation. "When you leave this table, you will look bored. You will look like a waitress who has just been mildly inconvenienced by an old man's small requests." He took a slow sip. "And whatever your name is tonight," he said, even more quietly, "you will keep it." Ugh. She saw it in the wine. Not literally, but close enough. It was the way the sommelier hesitated before pouring the Don's glass during the ceremonial toast. A quarter-second pause, invisible to everyone in the room who wasn't looking for it. Lucy was always looking for it. The pause was the kind a man makes when he knows what's in the bottle and is privately reconciling himself with what comes next. She was already moving before the glass reached the table. Not running. Running would have caused exactly the kind of attention that got people killed in rooms like this. She moved the way she had trained herself to move through dangerous spaces, with the fluid, purposeful calm of someone who belonged exactly where they were going. She intercepted the sommelier at the corner of the table with a soft touch to his elbow and the serene, apologetic smile of a senior server correcting a junior one. "Wrong vintage," she said quietly, in Italian, taking the bottle from his hand with the smooth authority of someone who did this every night. "The Don requested the 9, not the 11. I'll take it from here." The sommelier blinked, relinquished the bottle, stepped back. Lucy set it on her tray without breaking stride and kept walking, through the east wing, through the service corridor, directly to Ricky's station, where she set the bottle down and said very calmly, "Don't let anyone touch this. Don't open it. Don't move it. And quietly, without alarming anyone, tell me if that sommelier tries to leave the building." Ricky stared at her. A different Ricky than the one who had worried about her 2 hours ago. He could see it, Whatever had been soft and careful about the girl he knew had reorganized itself into something with edges. "Lucy, what?" "Please," she said, and something in her voice closed the question entirely. She went back to the East Wing. What happened in the next 4 minutes was not chaos. Chaos was disorganized, and what Lucy did was the opposite of disorganized. She repositioned 2 of the senior servers to block the room's secondary exits without explaining why. She caught the eye of the most alert of Stephen's bodyguards and held it for exactly 2 seconds with an expression that said, "There is a problem, and you need to trust me right now." The kind of expression that only worked if you had the bearing to back it up. And Lucy, in that moment, had forgotten entirely that she was supposed to be nobody. The bodyguard straightened, moved to Stephen's side, said something low and urgent into his earpiece. Stephen's eyes found Lucy across the room. She met them directly for the first time all evening. In his expression, she saw the question he had been building since the moment she bowed. "Who are you?" becoming something more urgent and more specific. She turned away and kept working. The red skirt was never going to be invisible again. The first shot came through the anteroom window at 11:17. Not a clean shot. It caught the molding above the partition, raining plaster across the table where Don Pietro had been sitting 30 seconds earlier. 30 seconds earlier, because Lucy had moved him. She hadn't asked permission. She hadn't explained. She had simply appeared at the Don's shoulder, said "now" in the mountain dialect, and watched an elderly man who trusted no one stand up and follow her without hesitation into the service corridor. Stephen found them there 45 seconds later, gun drawn, 2 of his guards flanking him, his face arranged into the particular controlled blankness of a man operating at the outer edge of his patience. "There are 4 of them," Lucy said before he could speak. 2 came through the catering entrance, 1 through the east fire exit, 1 is still on the roof managing the angle. The sommelier was the inside contact. Ricky has him contained in the dry store. She paused. The roof position is your most urgent problem. He has a sightline to this corridor in approximately 3 minutes when the Castone motorcade moves to the front. The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds. "Who are you?" Stephen said. Not the procedural version from the kitchen, the real version, the one underneath it. She had known this moment was coming since the bow. She had rehearsed 17 different deflections, 4 partial truths, 2 exits that didn't require an answer at all. She had a good lie ready, a clean one, the kind that came with enough texture to survive initial scrutiny. She looked at Don Pietro instead. The old man gave her nothing. No nod, no permission, no guidance. Just the steady, patient gaze of someone who had already made his choice hours ago at a candle-lit table with a worn coin between them, and was now simply waiting to see if she would make hers. She looked back at Stephen. "My name," she said quietly, "is Luciana Valenti. Marco Valenti was my father. The archives your tattoos lead to are his. He encoded the locations himself, which means someone in your organization has been carrying a map to the most dangerous documents in the Eastern underworld on their body for the last decade without knowing what it meant." She watched him process it, watched the pieces move behind his eyes, the dialect, the bow, his father's reaction, the coin, the tattoos, every anomaly of the evening assembling itself into a shape that was simultaneously impossible and the only thing that explained everything. His jaw tightened. "The Valentis are dead," he said. "Yes," Lucy said. "They tried very hard to make that true." From somewhere above them, the roof position shifted. 3 minutes had become 90 seconds. Lucy looked at Stephen with the steady, stripped-back clarity of someone who had run out of cover and was done pretending otherwise. "Are we going to keep talking?" she said, "or are we going to move?" Stephen moved first. Lucy moved with him. Not behind him, with him, which she could feel surprised him in the first 3 seconds of the corridor, when he cut left toward the ballroom's secondary entrance, and she was already there, already reading the geometry of the space, already knowing which angle gave them cover and which one got them killed. Don Pietro had been handed to the 2 most senior guards with instructions Lucy delivered in a dialect the guards didn't speak, which meant the instructions were for the Don alone. He had looked at her with those 70-year-old eyes and given her a single, almost imperceptible nod. Then he had allowed himself to be moved, and Lucy had turned toward the ballroom, and whatever remained of the girl in the red skirt quietly ceased to exist. The ballroom had 3 of them, the 2 from the catering entrance and one she hadn't fully accounted for, positioned near the bar with the patient stillness of a professional who had been in place for hours. Stephen clocked him at the same moment she did. She felt rather than saw the micro-adjustment in his stride. "Bar first," she said, barely audible. "I know," he said. They didn't discuss it further. There was nothing to discuss. What happened in the next 4 minutes was not elegant. Real violence never was. It was fast and ugly, and decided by margins so thin they barely qualified as decisions. Stephen was exceptional. She had expected that. What she hadn't expected was how completely she remembered being exceptional herself. The muscle memory lived in her hands and her feet, and the precise angle of her weight distribution, stored somewhere below language, below thought, 10 years of careful dormancy dissolving in under 30 seconds. Her father's blade, the one she had carried every shift for 3 years in the seam of her apron like a talisman she'd never intended to use, found her hand without her consciously reaching for it. The man near the bar made one mistake. He tracked Stephen and forgot about the waitress. He would not make a second mistake. The second man came from behind a toppled table and found Lucy already turned, already set, the blade doing the thing blades did when held by someone who had been trained since childhood by the most disciplined security force in the Sicilian underworld. Brief, decisive, final. The third went to Stephen, and Stephen was thorough. Afterward, the ballroom held the particular, ringing silence of a space where something irreversible had just occurred. Broken glass, overturned furniture, 2 candelabras still burning on the floor, throwing long shadows across the marble. Lucy straightened, blade down, breathing controlled. She became aware, gradually, of Stephen standing 6 feet away, watching her with an expression she had not yet seen on his face. Not suspicion, not calculation. Something that had no business existing in a room that looked like this. She looked away first. "The roof," she said. "There's still the roof." The roof position had already gone by the time they reached it. Not fled, gone, in the permanent sense, which told Lucy everything she needed to know about who had sent him and how seriously they took loose ends. She stood at the parapet for a moment, looking out over the city, the cold February air hitting her face like a correction after the heat and smoke of the ballroom below. Stephen stood beside her. Neither of them spoke for a long time. It was Stephen who broke it. "The Council of 12 ordered the hit," he said. Not a question. He had been assembling it since the ballroom. She could tell, the specific silence of a man rearranging everything he thought he knew about his own organization. "They've been trying to close the Valenti account for 10 years, Lucy said. "Tonight was an opportunity. Your father on foreign soil, a crowded room full of plausible suspects." She paused. They didn't expect the waitress. She felt him look at her sideways. "No one ever does," he said, and there was something in it that wasn't quite dry and wasn't quite warm, but existed somewhere in the precise territory between the two. She almost smiled. She didn't. The gathering happened 3 days later. Stephen called it. Every captain, every lieutenant, every significant figure in the Castone organization's northeastern infrastructure, assembled in the same grand hall that still bore the faint ghost of Tuesday's chaos beneath its hastily restored surface. The chandelier had been rehung. The marble had been cleaned. Only someone who knew exactly where to look would find the evidence of what had happened here. Lucy stood at the back of the room in a different uniform. Still white, still pressed, old habits. Don Pietro was seated at the head of the assembly, his bearing unchanged, his overcoat black, his hands folded on the table with the absolute stillness of a man who had already known how this would end and had been patient enough to wait for everyone else to catch up. Stephen stood at the center of the room and spoke for 11 minutes. Lucy didn't hear most of it. She was watching faces, reading the room the way she always read rooms, cataloging the men who looked unsurprised alongside the men who looked dangerous in their surprise. She filed both categories away with the methodical calm of someone who understood that tonight was not an ending. It was an inventory. She heard her name, her real name, Luciana Valenti, delivered by Stephen's voice into that assembly like a stone dropped into still water, and she watched the ripple move across every face in the room. Recognition, calculation, fear, in the ones old enough to remember what the Valenti name had meant before the fire. Then Stephen turned to face her across the length of the hall. And he bowed. Not a gesture, not a performance for the room, though the room was watching with the collective held breath of men witnessing something that would be spoken about for the next 20 years in careful, private language. It was the real thing, the same deep, unhurried, ancient bow she had given his father 4 days ago in a moment she thought would end her life. He had looked it up, he had learned it, he had done it correctly. The silence in the hall was absolute. Lucy stood at the back of the room in her white blouse and her red skirt, 10 years of hiding dissolving quietly behind her eyes, and she held his gaze across the marble floor and did not look away. Then she walked forward. Not soft, not invisible, not the blank stare and the careful step of a woman trying to disappear. She walked the way she had been born to walk, through a room that parted for her without being asked, toward a table that had been waiting for her name on it for a decade. She sat down. Don Pietro, beside her, said nothing. He simply unfolded his hands and rested them on the table, open, in the old gesture of a completed covenant. The new order did not announce itself with speeches or gunfire, or the formal ceremonies the underworld usually preferred for its transitions of power. It announced itself with a waitress in a red skirt taking her seat. And the room, finally understanding what it was looking at, went very, very still. You just finished the story that started with 1 bow and 3 words. If Lucy's journey kept you reading, from the frozen grand hall to the final seat at the table, subscribe now and hit the notification bell. The next story is already being written, and if you thought the Valenti ghost was dangerous, wait until you meet who comes for her next. Subscribe. The next chapter of the universe drops soon. Don't be the last one to know.